The thick fog clung to the branches of the acacia trees, refusing to give way to the dawn. Tariku Sissoko stood at the edge of a red earth embankment, feeling the morning cold seep through his worn khaki cotton shirt. His work boots, still covered in dried mud from yesterday's rain, held firm in the soft soil. 48 years old, 30 of them as a ranger in Kruger National Park, had taught him to read the savannah like an open book. But on the morning when everything changed, he wasn't just reading the land. He was reading his own nightmares, the ones that had taken root in his mind a year ago and refused to leave. Every morning as he approached this place by the river, he saw the same image. His younger brother Jabari falling into the rushing water, his arms reaching out one last time above the surface, while Tariku stood frozen on the bank, paralyzed by fear, unable to help him. Jabari used to laugh at his caution. "Brother," he would say, adjusting his worn-out hat, "you think too much. Nature doesn't tolerate doubt. You're either part of this world or a stranger in it." They often patrolled together in the early years when Jabari was just starting out as a ranger. His younger brother was a natural tracker. He could tell the story of any animal that passed by just by its faint tracks. "Look," Jabari would say, crouching near the lion prints. "This was a female with cubs. See how she placed her paws?" She was nervous, probably sensed hyenas. He would run his finger around the edge of the track. And here she stopped. She was listening. A mother always knows when her children are in danger. Tariku remembered how his brother winked at him then. "You know what, Tariku? I bet you'll tame these lions before you ever find yourself a wife." They both laughed, but there was a bit of truth in Jabari's joke. Tariku really did understand lions better than he understood people. Maybe because lions were honest and clear in their intentions. Now that joke echoed in his head like a curse. Jabari wasn't laughing anymore. And the lions had become a source of constant fear. After his brother's tragic death, Tariku would sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming of a pride of lions surrounding the drowning Jabari in the water. Not helping him, just watching, the same way Tariku had watched that terrible day. Every sound meant something. This, Tariku knew for sure. A distant baboon's bark signaled a predator nearby. The sudden silence of the birds warned of danger. The crack of dry branches under antelope hooves told where the herd was moving. But this morning, something felt off. The air smelled of rain and fear, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. A feeling that something bad was coming. His patrol area, about 12 square miles of wild African land, was in the very heart of the park, where the Sabi River made a dangerous bend around granite cliffs before the Mbulu Falls. The local Zulus called this place Umgodi Wakufa, the Pit of Death. Over the past 20 years, 7 tourists and 2 rangers had died here. One of them was Tariku's younger brother. The water looked calm, almost lazy, as it slid between mossy rocks. But beneath the surface, deadly currents waited, strong enough to pull down an adult in seconds. Tariku knew every rock, every turn of that river. He had to. It was right here a year ago that the wild water took his younger brother's life. That night it had poured rain, just like yesterday. A group of German tourists had crashed on the opposite bank. Their jeep slipped off the road and overturned. A woman was screaming that her husband wasn't breathing. The radio said help was delayed due to washed-out roads. Jabari didn't wait. "Someone has to help them," he said as he pulled off his boots. Tariku grabbed his arm. "Wait until morning. The current's too strong." But Jabari shook his head. "What if it were your wife? Would you wait?" And before Tariku could stop him, he dove into the water. For the first 65 feet, Jabari swam confidently. Tariku shone the flashlight at him, shouting warnings about rocks and whirlpools. His brother waved, showing that everything was fine. But in the middle of the river, the current grew stronger. Tariku saw Jabari struggling against the water, his head bobbing in and out of the waves. "Jabari!" he shouted, but the wind and water drowned out his voice. The last thing he saw was his brother's hand reaching for the night sky before the dark waters swallowed it forever. Tariku stood on the bank for another half hour, shining his flashlight over the river and calling his brother's name until he realized the terrible truth. The German tourists were rescued in the morning. The woman's husband was alive. He had only lost consciousness from hitting his head. Jabari died for a man who could have waited until dawn. The memory hit like a physical blow. Jabari, 31 years old, father of two, an experienced tracker. The search operation lasted 4 days. Helicopters circled above the valley, dogs searched the riverbanks, divers methodically combed the bottom. Jabari's body was found 9 miles downstream, caught in the roots of an old baobab tree. His face was peaceful, as if he were just sleeping. Tariku shook his head to drive away the heavy thoughts. There was work to do. Yesterday's downpour, the first real rain after 3 months of drought, had turned the dry stream beds into fast-moving flows and had once again seriously damaged the old wooden bridge across the river. It was the only safe crossing in his area, and without it, all tourist routes would have to be closed. The ranger made his way down a narrow path to the riverbank, carefully stepping between the slippery rocks. His boots left clear prints in the red clay. The damage to the bridge was worse than he had expected. 3 main beams were broken, one support was completely washed away, and the metal cables were torn and hung in the water like dead snakes. Tariku pulled a notebook and pencil from his worn leather backpack and began making sketches and notes. At least a week of work would be needed: 4,000 pounds of lumber, new cables, and concrete for the supports. He estimated the cost. The bosses wouldn't be happy. The park's budget was already tight, and after recent cuts, every dollar had to be fought for. The water was rising. The usually calm river now rushed like a mountain stream, waves crashing against rocks and leaving white foamy trails. The roar of the waterfall, which during the dry season was barely audible, now echoed across the whole valley. Even here, about a third of a mile away, the ground vibrated slightly from the massive falling water. Suddenly, Tariku felt like he was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical weight, like someone's stare pressing against the back of his head. The hairs on his neck stood on end. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves, he lifted his head from the notebook. A low growl tore through the air. The sound was deep, rough, and full of warning. Tariku froze, but his senses went razor sharp. The sound had come from the opposite riverbank, a bit upstream. Another growl followed, longer this time. Then a second voice joined in, and a third. This wasn't a random encounter. It was almost like the predators were talking to each other. Slowly, making no sudden moves, Tariku raised his eyes. On the red earthen terrace of the opposite bank stood a pride of lions, a large male with a dark, almost black mane. Tariku recognized him instantly. Local rangers called him Mfumu, the king. Beside him were 3 adult lionesses and several younger lions of various ages. But the way they stood was strange. Normally, when lions spotted a person, they either walked away or took a neutral pose, lying down to show they meant no harm. But now the entire pride was standing, and all their attention was fixed on him. Not hostile, but so intense that it made the ranger's skin crawl. This pride had lived in his area for the past 3 years. They'd chased away the previous group of lions and claimed the territory as their own. They usually avoided people, but weren't afraid of them. Tariku had crossed paths with them many times, and each time there had been an unspoken truce. You don't touch us, we won't touch you. But today something was wrong. The lions were restless. The male was pacing along the bank, letting out low growls. His movements were tense, his tail twitching side to side. Classic signs of strong agitation. The lionesses were on edge too. Their tails flicked and their ears were pinned back. One of them, a large female with a scar on her left side, stepped down to the water's edge but immediately jumped back, as if something had frightened her. Tariku slowly shifted his gaze, trying to find the source of their distress, and then he saw it. About 30 feet from the bank, on a small rock in the middle of the rushing current, sat a lion cub. Very young, no more than 3 months old, with fluffy golden fur and oversized paws. It was shaking from cold and fear, its soft mewing barely audible over the roar of the water, but every sound was filled with desperation. The rock was no more than 3 feet wide, wet and slick from constant spray. Every second, waves splashed the little one with freezing water, and it was clearly losing strength trying to hold on. Its tiny claws scraped at the wet granite, its legs trembling from exhaustion. It was clear. The cub was at its limit. Just a little longer, and it wouldn't be able to hold on anymore. The ranger quickly understood what had happened. During the night's rain, the lion pride had come to the river to drink. The cub, still inexperienced and curious, got too close to the edge. The rain-soaked bank collapsed immediately, and the little one fell into the water. By some miracle, he managed to cling to that rock. The only thing that saved him from a deadly fall into the waterfall. The adult lions were pacing along the bank in panic. The male made short lunges toward the water, growling at the rushing waves as if he could scare the river itself. His growls were becoming more desperate. Tariku had never heard a lion make such sounds before. It wasn't the roar of a predator, it was the cry of a parent losing their child. But even for a lion, with all his weight and strength, the river's current was far too strong. The lionesses tried to find a safer path downstream, but everywhere the water foamed and churned between sharp rocks. One of them, likely the cub's mother, came right up to the water's edge, growling as if calling her baby, but then stepped back, realizing she was powerless. Tariku watched this scene, and something inside him suddenly broke. The lioness was doing exactly what he had done a year ago, standing on the bank, watching someone she loved dying in the water. In her posture was the same desperate helplessness, the same guilt over not being able to help. The cub cried again, and the sound pierced Tariku to his core. The little one was doomed. The rock was slowly being eaten away by the current. He could see tiny pieces of granite breaking off. At most, the cub had an hour, maybe two, before he would slip and be swept toward the waterfall. "This isn't your business," Tariku told himself, repeating the first rule of a ranger's job. Don't interfere with the natural course of events. Nature is cruel, but these are her laws. Death is as much a part of wildlife as birth and hunting. He turned toward his jeep, parked not far from the riverbank, but his legs wouldn't move. The image of Jabari rose in his mind again. His brother had also been right in the middle of the river that terrible night. He had also cried out, asking for help, and Tariku had stood on the bank, paralyzed by fear, doing nothing, staring helplessly into the dark. He remembered every second of that awful night, how Jabari fought the current, how his strength faded, how he called his older brother's name one last time before the water swallowed him forever. "Tariku," was Jabari's voice echoing in his memory. "Help me." But he hadn't helped. He had only stood there watching helplessly as his brother died, unable to step into the rushing river. The cub cried again, and the sound felt like a cry for help. Tariku looked at the pride. The adult lions stood frozen, staring in his direction. Their eyes were full of a strange hope, as if they understood that only this man could save their cub. In the lioness mother's eyes, he saw the same helplessness he had felt a year ago, the same desperate plea for help. And then something inside him broke. Damn it, he swore through clenched teeth and headed toward the jeep. In the trunk, among tools and spare parts, lay climbing gear, necessary for working in the park's mountainous areas. Tariku pulled out a long nylon rope, as thick as a finger, a climbing harness, carabiners, and a belay device. His hands trembled as he checked each knot, each connection. A life depended on this. Not just the cub's, but his own. "Don't be an idiot," he told himself, adjusting the safety straps. "You have no right to risk your life for a wild animal." But Jabari's voice in his head was louder. "What if it were your child? Would you wait?" The ranger found a suitable tree, an old sycamore with a thick trunk growing near the riverbank. Its roots reached deep into the earth, and the trunk was strong and undamaged. Tariku tied the rope around the trunk using a special climbing knot that only tightens under pressure. He clipped the other end to his harness through the belay device. The pride on the other side of the river had gone quiet, watching his preparations. The lions seemed to understand that this man was about to do something important. Even the cub on the rock stopped crying and stared at Tariku with huge, frightened eyes. The water was shockingly cold. The mountain stream, fed by melting snow from the distant Drakensberg peaks, carried the icy breath of high altitudes. Tariku stepped slowly into the river, feeling the cold pierce through his clothes, every cell in his body tightening from the shock. His breathing turned ragged, his muscles tensed. The riverbed was treacherously slippery. The smooth stones, covered with a thin layer of silt and algae, gave no firm footing. Every step required full concentration. The current immediately tried to knock the man off his feet, pushing against his side, trying to drag him downstream. Tariku dug in his boots, grabbed at rocks, but the water was stronger. Memories of Jabari hit him in waves. He saw his brother's face in every splash, heard his voice in the sound of the current. "Don't repeat my mistakes," Jabari seemed to say, "but don't let them die because of your fear." Halfway to the rock, the ranger slipped. His foot got caught in a gap between the stones, and Tariku fell forward into the water. The icy water hit his face, rushed into his nose and mouth. The salty taste of his own blood mixed with river water. He tried to get up, but the current immediately dragged him down. The rope went tight, the belay device kicked in, but the jolt was so strong it knocked the air from his lungs. For a few seconds, he hung in the water like a rag doll, fighting the current, trying to find any footing. Panic started clouding his mind. The same panic he had felt that night, watching Jabari drown. On the riverbank, the lion stood frozen, watching the man fight the merciless force of nature. Even the cub on the rock had gone quiet, as if he understood that this man was risking his life for him. "Stand up," Tariku ordered himself. "Stand up, or you'll both die." Finally, the ranger managed to find a foothold. The water was up to his chest, his breathing ragged, his heart pounding wildly. But he kept moving. Each step became harder. The current grew stronger as he neared the center of the river. His legs went numb from the cold. His arms barely obeyed him. The cub saw him approaching and let out a soft sound, somewhere between a meow and a moan. The little one was at the edge of collapse. His golden fur was soaked and dark, his tiny body trembling from cold and exhaustion. His wide eyes looked at Tariku with surprising trust, as if he understood this man had come to help. When Tariku reached the rock, he gently lifted the cub in his arms. The little one didn't resist. He simply had no strength left. He was light, no more than 6.5 pounds, but in the water every ounce counted. Tariku pressed the cub to his chest, feeling the tiny heart beating fast. The cub let out a faint whimper and buried his face in the man's wet shirt. "Hold on, little one," Tariku whispered. "We're almost home." The way back was a true nightmare. The extra weight threw off his balance, and the cub, in panic, dug his claws into the shirt, making it harder to move. The current, as if sensing new prey, grew even stronger. The water dragged at him, spun him around, pushed him toward the waterfall. Tariku could hear its roar growing louder and louder. Twice he lost his footing and fell. The second time, he was dragged along the bottom before the rope stopped him. His knees and elbows were scraped raw against the rocks. The taste of blood was back in his mouth. The cub whimpered weakly but still held on. Tariku kept moving, one hand clutching the cub, the other grabbing at rocks. Visions of Jabari's death mixed with reality. Tariku saw his brother's face in every wave, heard his voice calling for help. "Don't let them die," Jabari whispered. "Don't be like me. Don't try to be a hero. Just save them." The last steps to the bank felt like forever. His legs gave out, his lungs burned from lack of oxygen, his vision swam with colored spots. When Tariku finally felt solid ground beneath his feet, it felt like a miracle. He pulled himself onto the bank and collapsed to his knees, still clutching the cub to his chest. For several minutes, he just sat there, breathing hard, shivering from cold and adrenaline. The little one was alive, but his condition was worrying. He barely moved, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. His small body was ice cold from the freezing water. Tariku gently checked the cub. Hypothermia, exhaustion, but no serious injuries, it seemed. He took off his wet shirt and wrapped it around the cub, trying to warm the tiny body. Then he held the little one in his arms and began softly massaging his paws to restore circulation. Only then did he lift his eyes to the opposite bank. The pride hadn't left. All the lions were still standing at the water's edge, staring tensely in his direction. Tariku expected aggression. After all, he was holding their cub. Any mother should have rushed to protect her young. But instead of growls or signs of attack, he saw something entirely different. A large lioness with a scar near her right eye, Clearly, the cub's mother stood right at the edge, and there was no threat in her posture. She stared at Tariku intently, but in her eyes was something humans would call gratitude. Her tail was still, her ears were relaxed, all signs of calm. The rest of the pride also showed no aggression. They were simply watching, and in their stillness was a sense of understanding. The male lion, Mafumu, took a few steps forward. Tariku tensed, preparing for a possible attack. But the lion stopped at the edge of the water and unexpectedly lowered his head. It was a gesture Tariku had never seen from a wild lion, a gesture of recognition, of gratitude. The lion cub was slowly coming back to life. He raised his head, looked around with weak eyes, and let out a soft call. From across the river, the lioness, his mother, answered immediately. Her voice was full of tenderness and relief. She called back with short, gentle sounds that seemed to say, "I'm here, little one. Mama's here." The cub tried to stand on his trembling legs and walk toward the water, but Tariku gently stopped him. "Not now, little one. You're still too weak, and the river is too strong." He picked up the cub and carried him away from the riverbank, under the wide branches of an acacia tree. It was dry there, and relatively warm. The cub didn't resist. It seemed he understood this man wouldn't hurt him. More than that, he felt safe in the arms of his rescuer. Tariku sat down next to the tree, his back against the trunk, thinking about what to do next. He couldn't leave the cub alone. Without his mother, the little one would die within a day. But it was impossible to carry him across the raging river, at least not today. They would have to wait until the water calmed down, but that could take days, maybe weeks. Time passed slowly. The sun rose higher, and the air began to warm. The cub was gradually getting warmer, his breathing steadier. He even tried to play with the end of Tariku's shoelace, a good sign. His little paws no longer trembled as much, and his eyes began to show curiosity about the world around him. The pride on the opposite bank hadn't moved either, and that was strange. Usually lions don't stay in one place long without a clear reason, but now the entire family had settled in the shade of large rocks, positioning themselves so they could always see their cub and the man who saved him. Tariku began noticing small details in their behavior that he had missed before. The lioness, the mother, would sometimes get up and approach the edge of the water, making soft calling sounds. The cub would answer with a tiny meow, and a sort of conversation would happen between them. The other lionesses joined in too, encouraging the cub with short, rumbling sounds. The male stayed a bit farther back, but his full attention was on what was happening. From time to time, he lifted his head and looked around the area, playing his role as protector. But his gaze always returned to the man and the cub. By noon, the heat became intense. The thermometer on Tariku's backpack showed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. The cub was starting to suffer from thirst. He licked his lips and whined softly. Tariku pulled a plastic water bottle from his backpack and carefully gave the cub a drink. The little one lapped at the water eagerly, another good sign. But Tariku knew these were only temporary measures. The cub needed his mother's milk, the care of his pride. Most of all, the ranger couldn't abandon his duties to stay here forever. Other areas of the park needed watching too, especially after last night's storm. The decision came on its own. He would have to take the cub back to base and contact the veterinary service. Maybe they could care for him temporarily until the river calmed down. It would break every rule about not interfering with wild animals, but there was no other option. The ranger couldn't let the cub die after everything that had happened. Tariku gently picked up the cub, who was no longer deeply asleep, and lifted his head from time to time and headed toward the jeep. The pride across the river rose to their feet, sensing movement. The lioness let out a long, sorrowful sound. A goodbye to the cub she might never see again. The sound was so full of sadness that Tariku's heart ached. The other lions began to growl too, but not threateningly, more like mournfully. It was the whole family saying goodbye to their youngest member. Tariku stopped by the jeep and looked back. The lions stood in a row along the riverbank, like an honor guard seeing their cub off. "I'll bring him back," he said out loud, even though he knew the lions couldn't understand his words. But something in his tone, maybe, reached them, because the growling slowly faded. The drive back to base took half an hour. Tariku drove carefully, trying not to disturb the cub. The little one lay on the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel, curiously looking at the unfamiliar surroundings. Tariku stopped a few times to check on him and give him more water. The National Park base was a complex of low, red brick buildings surrounded by barbed wire. It housed administrative offices, workshops, storage areas, ranger barracks, and a small veterinary clinic. The place was noisy. Generators hummed, service dogs barked, and supply trucks moved back and forth. On the front porch of the main building, Tariku was met by Peter van der Merwe, the park's deputy director. A 60-year-old South African with a gray beard and sun-weathered face, he had worked in Kruger for over 30 years and had seen it all. When he saw the bundle in Tariku's arms, he frowned. "What have you got there, Tariku?" he asked, already sensing trouble. "A lion cub. I found him in my sector. Got separated from the pride during the storm." Peter shook his head and let out a heavy sigh. "You know the rules, Tariku. We're not supposed to interfere with nature. It breaks the natural balance. How many times have we talked about this? Especially after what happened with your brother." The mention of Jabari made Tariku clench his jaw. The cub nearly died. He was stranded on a rock in the middle of the river. Just a baby. The current would have taken him in an hour or two. "And that would have been natural selection," Peter said firmly. "We're not gods of nature, Tariku. We're its observers." Tariku looked down at the sleeping cub in his arms, then back at Peter. "And what if it were your child?" Peter was silent for a moment, studying his younger colleague's face. He knew about the tragedy with Jabari and understood what Tariku was going through. In 30 years working in the park, he himself had broken the rules a few times, when his heart overruled the manual. "All right," he said at last, his voice softening. "But this is temporary. As soon as there's a chance, we return the cub to the wild, and no one says a word about how he got here. Officially, we found him orphaned." Veterinarian Dr. Kate Macabelli arrived half an hour later. A dark-skinned woman in her 40s, she was one of the top wildlife specialists in South Africa. Her clinic often cared for injured or orphaned animals. When she saw the cub, she immediately switched into professional mode. The examination was thorough. Dr. Macabelli checked his temperature, pulse, reflexes, fur condition, and claws. The cub behaved surprisingly calmly, allowing the unfamiliar woman to examine him. Perhaps the stress he had gone through made him more submissive. "Hypothermia and mild exhaustion," she diagnosed. "But overall, he's healthy. Just over 6 pounds. That's normal for a 3-month-old cub. No injuries, good reflexes, strong teeth and claws. A tough little guy. We can keep him here for a few days," she added, gently stroking the cub's head. "We have a special milk formula for lion cubs in a suitable enclosure. But we can't keep him long. He needs to grow up in the wild with his family." Tariku nodded, but inside he felt tight with worry. He knew what could happen. If the cub stayed away from his pride too long, he might lose his survival instincts. And if the pride moved out of the territory, the cub would remain an orphan forever. At best, he'd be sent to a zoo. At worst, declared unfit for life in the wild. News of the lion cub spread quickly through the base. By evening, nearly everyone had stopped by the clinic. Reactions were mixed. Jacob Matlana, a young biologist fresh out of university, was thrilled. "Just imagine the research opportunities. We can study the cub's behavior in captivity, his responses, development." Old Ranger Abel Masili, who had been working in the park since the apartheid era, shook his head. "It's a bad omen. Man shouldn't mess with the lions. The ancestors won't forgive it." Mechanic Frank O'Connor, an Irishman with 40 years of experience, shrugged. "A cub's a cub. Cute little guy. But what are we supposed to do with him?" The harshest reaction came from Security Chief Dirk Stein. "This breaks every protocol. The commission from Pretoria arrives tomorrow. What do we tell them? That our rangers are running a petting zoo now?" Tariku listened to the arguments and realized he was in a difficult position. Saving the cub had been an emotional, impulsive decision. Now he would have to face the bureaucratic consequences. The next 2 days were filled with intense work. Tariku organized the delivery of materials to repair the bridge. A truckload of lumber, cement, new cables, and construction tools. The job was going to be long and tough, but he was grateful for the distraction from thinking about the cub and what might happen because of his actions. Meanwhile, the cub was doing well. Dr. Machiavelli fed him a special formula from a bottle every 3 hours, and he was quickly gaining weight. The little one was playful and curious, happily batting at rubber toys. But sometimes a look of sadness would appear in his eyes. He clearly missed his family. It showed most in the evenings when he would curl up in a corner of the enclosure and whimper softly. Tariku visited him every day. The cub recognized the voice of his rescuer even before seeing him and purred with joy when he approached. It touched Tariku deeply and also made him feel even more responsible. On the third day, Tariku returned to the river to continue work on the bridge. The water had gone down a little, but the current was still dangerous. He hoped to see the pride again, but the opposite bank was empty. His heart sank. The lions were gone, just as he had feared. The family hadn't waited. Their survival instincts must have driven them to seek a new territory. Or had they? Tariku carefully scanned the opposite bank with binoculars. There were no visible signs of lions, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Lions are masters of camouflage. They could be watching him, completely unseen. He began work on the bridge, trying not to think about the cub, who might soon be sent to a zoo in Pretoria. There he would be cared for, but he would never become a real wild lion. The thought of it was unbearable. Working in the water required total focus. Tariku installed new supports for the bridge using concrete blocks and metal reinforcement. The water reached his waist, but near the shore the current wasn't as strong. He worked methodically, checking every joint, every bolt, trying not to think about what had happened in this exact spot 3 days ago. The sun stood high in the sky, and the heat became unbearable. Tariku decided to take a break. He climbed out of the water and sat on the bank, pulling a bottle of water from his backpack. It was at that moment he heard a splash behind him. Too loud for a fish, too steady to be a falling rock. Tariku turned slowly, and the blood froze in his veins. Just a few steps away, near the bank, in the water lay a massive crocodile. The reptile was at least 15 feet long, a true monster from prehistoric times. Its gray-green skin was covered in scars from old fights and territorial battles. Its powerful jaws were slightly open, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth the length of an adult man's finger. Yellow eyes with vertical pupils stared at him without blinking, full of cold, primal malice. Tariku recognized this crocodile. Local rangers called him Inkosikazi, the chief, an old male who had ruled this stretch of river for over 20 years. He was responsible for the deaths of at least 5 people, including 2 poachers who tried to swim across the river at night, a German tourist who ignored the warnings and went for a swim, and a local boy who accidentally fell in. The crocodile had clearly been watching him for some time, waiting for the right moment to strike. These ancient predators were masters of ambush. They could lie motionless for hours, blending into the environment, even controlling their breathing, then strike with lightning speed. Tariku realized he had walked right into a perfectly set trap. His heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo through the entire valley. His mouth was dry, his hands started to shake. He tried to slowly edge back toward the shore, but the crocodile shifted, blocking his way. Its thick tail moved lazily in the water, ready to deliver a crushing blow. The reptile wasn't in a rush. It was savoring its victim's fear. Tariku knew he had almost no chance. Crocodiles strike from the water at speeds up to 25 miles per hour, and their jaws can bite through a thigh bone like a twig. One tail strike can break all a man's ribs, and if it got hold of him, it would drag him underwater and wait until he drowned, performing its deadly death roll. Memories of Jabari flooded his mind. He saw his brother's face in every ripple of water, heard his final cry for help. Not like this, he thought. Not here. Not now. The cub is waiting for me, but his body wouldn't obey. His muscles were frozen by primal fear of this ancient predator. Inkosikazi began to approach slowly. Its movements were smooth, almost hypnotic. Each flick of the tail brought it a few steps closer. The reptile's eyes never blinked, locked onto every move of its prey. Tariku felt the ice-cold terror locking every muscle. It was exactly like that night with Jabari. The same helplessness, the same sense of death creeping closer, the same cursed paralysis. The distance closed dangerously fast. Tariku could now see every detail of the predator's face. Old scars on its skin, algae caught in the ridges along its back, and a cloudy film over its eyes. The crocodile opened its jaws wider, showing rows of teeth, and let out a low hiss, a sound that chilled the blood. Suddenly, the air was ripped by a powerful roar. The sound was so loud and furious that the crocodile flinched and turned its massive head toward the source. Tariku looked up and saw a large lioness standing on a rocky ledge above the river. She was right at the edge, neck stretched forward, baring her teeth. Her mane stood on end, muscles tense beneath her golden fur, her entire body ready to pounce. It was one of the lionesses from the same pride, a young and muscular female, ready to defend any member of her family. She kept roaring, and in her voice was such fury, such protective aggression, that even Inkosakazi seemed momentarily shaken. Crocodiles are used to being unchallenged in their watery world, but this lion was unpredictable and bold. They came back, flashed through Tariku's mind. The pride didn't leave. They've been nearby all along. The ranger tried to take advantage of the predator's distraction and stepped carefully toward the shore, but the crocodile immediately turned its attention back to him. Its huge head swung around, yellow eyes locking onto their target once more. The distance between them was closing rapidly. Too close to run, too far to fight. Then something happened that Tariku couldn't have imagined even in his wildest dreams. A second lioness, the one with the scar, the mother of the rescued cub, leapt from the high riverbank straight into the rushing water. She landed beside the crocodile with a massive splash. The water churned violently as she struck. Inkosakazi turned to face this new threat, but the lioness was faster. Before the crocodile could react, she landed a powerful blow with her front paw right across its face. The strike was so strong that the huge reptile recoiled, letting out a hissing cry of pain and rage. Its armor was tough, but the nose and eyes were vulnerable, and the lioness knew it. A deadly fight broke out. The crocodile and lioness circled each other in the water near the shore, both looking for an opening to strike. Inkosakazi lunged with its jaws, trying to grab her, but she was too fast and agile. Each time the reptile attacked, she dodged to the side and struck back with her claws. The water around them turned red with blood, though it wasn't clear whose. The crocodile thrashed with its tail, creating waves that made it hard for the lioness to stay balanced. But she kept attacking. Her movements were precise and deliberate. She aimed for the eyes and nostrils, where the skin was thinner. Tariku realized this was his only chance. While the crocodile was fully distracted by the fight, he had to make it to shore. He began slowly backing away, trying not to splash or draw attention. But he couldn't take his eyes off the battle. The lioness was fighting with desperate bravery, but the crocodile was bigger and stronger. One tail strike could break her spine. One bite, and it would all be over. She was risking her life for the man who had saved her cub. The fight went on. The lioness struck again and again, but she was starting to tire. Her movements slowed slightly, her breathing became heavier. The crocodile sensed it and went on the offensive. It lunged forward in a lightning strike. Its jaws snapped shut with a terrifying crunch, dangerously close to the lioness's head. But the miss cost him. The lioness immediately struck back, her claws plunging deep into the reptile's left eye. Inkosakazi let out a roar of pain, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the earth. Blood gushed from the ruined eye, staining the water around his head bright red. That was enough. Wounded badly, the ancient predator realized the fight wasn't worth it. He began retreating slowly into deeper water, hissing angrily at the lioness as he went. She struck him a few more times but didn't follow. She knew that in deeper water, the crocodile would have the upper hand. When Inkosakazi finally disappeared into the murky river, leaving only ripples on the surface, the lioness turned to Tariku. He was still standing knee-deep in water near the shore, unable to believe he was still alive. The big cat slowly approached him, breathing heavily from the intense battle. They looked at each other in complete silence. Water streamed from the lioness's wet fur in thin rivulets, leaving dark patches on the red sand. Small claw wounds from the crocodile were bleeding slightly, but nothing seemed serious. There was no aggression in her eyes, only exhaustion and something that could be called mutual understanding between two beings who had survived a shared danger. Tariku slowly reached out his hand, and the lioness didn't pull away. She sniffed his fingers as if recognizing his scent, then gently touched his palm with her nose. The touch was surprisingly soft, warm, damp skin, and breath that smelled of the wild and of freedom. Her tongue was rough like sandpaper, but the gesture was tender. "Thank you," he whispered, and the lioness seemed to understand. She made a quiet sound. Not a roar, not a purr, but something in between. A sound of recognition and acceptance. A reply to his gratitude. Only then did Tariku notice the rest of the pride on the rocks above the river. The male, Mfumu, with his dark mane, stood on the highest ledge, watching everything unfold. His posture was proud and majestic, the stance of a leader approving his family's actions. Beside him stood two other lionesses and several teenage lions. They were all looking at the man without hostility, and at the center of the group, between the massive paws of the male, sat a small golden bundle. Tariku couldn't believe his eyes. It was the cub he had rescued 4 days earlier. The little one, who should have still been at the base clinic, was here, with his family. He looked bigger, more sure of himself. When the cub saw the man standing in the water, he stopped and stared at him with wide eyes, as if recognizing his rescuer. At last, Tariku understood what had happened. The pride had never left the territory. They had waited all this time, watching the river, waiting for the moment they could safely take their cub back. They had watched from a distance as the ranger worked on the bridge, as he came back here day after day. And when they saw him in mortal danger, they had come to help, just as you would help a member of your family. It was unbelievable, but it had happened. Wild predators, guided by a sense of gratitude and some deep instinct of justice, had saved a man from death. The lioness who had rescued him slowly climbed out of the water and stopped beside Tariku. Water streamed off her powerful body, leaving wet marks on the red earth. She was magnificent, the embodiment of wild strength and grace, a predator built by nature for hunting and survival. But in that moment, she was something more, an ally, a protector, almost a friend. The rest of the lions began to descend toward the river. They moved slowly without aggression, but with the cautiousness of wild animals. The male came last, constantly scanning the surroundings for threats. His role as leader demanded that he protect the pride, and he took it seriously. When all the lions had gathered at the water, Tariku found himself at the center of their loose circle. His heart was pounding from emotion, but there was no fear. He felt instinctively that these predators would not harm him. More than that, they had accepted him as an ally, as someone who had proven his loyalty and willingness to sacrifice for their family. The cub was the first to break the solemn moment. He jumped down from where he'd been sitting and ran over to Tariku, purring with joy. The little one clearly remembered his rescue and was happy to see his savior. He rubbed against Tariku's legs, leaving golden hairs on his trousers, and purred contentedly. "You've grown, little one," Tariku said softly, gently petting him. "And you're healthy. That means it was all worth it." The mother lioness stepped closer and carefully sniffed her cub, checking to make sure he was okay. Her movements were full of maternal tenderness and care. Once satisfied that he was safe and unharmed, she looked at Tariku with an expression that, on a human face, would be called deep gratitude. Mfumu, the male lion, also came forward. A massive lion weighing at least 500 pounds, he could kill a man with a single blow of his paw. But now there was no threat in his movements. He stopped directly in front of Tariku and lowered his mighty head, a gesture of respect rarely seen from wild animals. The pride stayed by the river for over an hour. It was a remarkable time, man and lions coexisting in a strange harmony, united by a shared experience of rescue and mutual gratitude. The young ones played on the shore, splashing in the shallow water. The adults took turns drinking and resting in the shade. Tariku sat on a large rock nearby, still unable to believe what had happened. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this unbelievable moment. Rescuing the lion cub from the raging river, the days of anxious waiting, the crocodile attack, the lioness's heroic rescue. Each action had led to the next, forming a bond between man and wild predators that defied all natural laws. Yet it existed nonetheless. The lioness who had saved him was lying near his rock, grooming her fur and cleaning herself after the fight. From time to time, she lifted her head and looked at Tariku, not with suspicion or caution, but with something like friendly curiosity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange and red hues, the pride rose and slowly headed into the savannah. It was hunting time. The cub ran alongside his mother, full of energy and life, but turned back several times as if to say goodbye to the man who had saved him. The male lion brought up the rear, glancing at Tariku occasionally. There was no hostility in his gaze, more like curiosity and something close to approval. Before the final departure, the lioness who had rescued Tariku approached him one last time. She stopped right in front of him and lowered her head. Tariku understood the gesture and reached out his hand. He gently stroked her between the ears, feeling the rough but warm fur under his palm. The lioness closed her eyes and let out a soft purring sound, a sound he would never forget for the rest of his life. Then she turned and walked briskly after her family. Soon all the lions had disappeared behind a low hill, leaving Tariku alone by the river, with his thoughts and incredible memories. He sat on the rock until nightfall, reflecting on everything that had happened. Something extraordinary had occurred in his life. Rescuing the cub had become a turning point, after which his relationship with the wild was forever changed. He was no longer just an observer or protector. He had become part of a family that extended beyond the human world. The next day, he returned to the base with a clear decision. Entering Dr. Machiavelli's clinic, he wasn't surprised to find the cub gone. "Where is he?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "This is the strangest thing I've ever seen," the veterinarian said, throwing up her hands. "I came in to feed him this morning, and the enclosure was empty. The fence wasn't damaged, no signs of a break-in, but the cub is gone. It's like he just vanished into thin air." "What do the security cameras show?" Tariku asked. "That's the weird part. There are some shadows near the enclosure around 3 a.m. The footage is unclear, night vision, but they look like large animals. Then the latch on the cage opens, almost like by itself." "By itself?" "Well, we see something interacting with it from the outside. There was no lock, just a simple latch. Technically, it could be opened, if you knew how. But who could do that at night?" Tariku looked closely at the footage. In the blurry frames, dark shapes moved. Too large for dogs, too cautious to be people. And the latch opened as if lifted by an experienced paw. "Maybe the cub figured out how to get out," he said, though he knew the little one was too small to reach the latch from outside. Dr. Machiavelli shrugged. "Nature is full of mysteries. The important thing is that he made it back to his family." For several days, the base's security staff was baffled. Dirk Stein personally inspected the perimeter and questioned every night shift employee. No one had seen or heard anything. The guard dogs had behaved strangely. They whined and hid in their kennels all night, but gave no warning of an intrusion. "This is impossible," Stein repeated, studying the security layout. "Lions can't just sneak into a guarded area, open a latch, and disappear without a trace." But Tariku knew lions better than most. He knew what they were capable of when it came to protecting their family. A mother's instinct and the loyalty of a pride could create miracles. In the following weeks, Tariku regularly encountered the pride in his patrol area. The lions no longer avoided him. They allowed him to come closer than ever before, a rare sign of deep trust in the wild. Sometimes in the mornings, he found tracks from their nightly patrols around his temporary camp during long workdays. The cub grew quickly and became stronger. A month after reuniting with his family, he was already 1.5 times larger, actively playing with the other cubs and starting to learn the basics of hunting. But his special bond with Tariku remained. The little one always recognized him from afar, and sometimes came closer than the others, as if he still remembered the man who had risked his life to save him. One morning, while finishing work on the bridge, Tariku found an unusual gift outside his tent. On the ground lay a large piece of acacia bark, a specific kind used by lions to sharpen their claws, and something very hard to find. The tracks around it made it clear who had brought the gift. It was a sign of recognition and acceptance into their greater family. That was the moment Tariku fully understood he had become part of their world. Not a member of the pride, that was impossible for a human, but an ally, one who was respected and protected. In the African savannah, he had found a family, wild and powerful, yet loyal and grateful. In the days that followed, as he continued repairing the bridge, Tariq often felt watching eyes on him. Lions would rest in the shade on nearby hills or under large trees, quietly observing his work. Their presence brought him a deep sense of safety. He knew that no predator would ever approach unnoticed. After the crocodile incident, he now had the most reliable bodyguards in the world. Nkosikazi never returned to that part of the river. Perhaps the lioness's claw marks and the loss of his eye had reminded the ancient predator that these waters were now guarded. Or maybe the old crocodile simply chose to hunt somewhere quieter, where he wouldn't have to face an angry pride. The bridge was fully rebuilt 3 weeks after that fateful day. The new structure, with a steel frame and treated wooden planks, was strong enough to carry the weight of a heavy truck. Tariku personally tested the bridge, driving back and forth across it several times in a fully loaded Jeep. The crossing was once again safe for tourists and service vehicles. On the day of the official bridge opening, when the commission from Pretoria and local officials arrived, the pride also came to see the completed work. The lions settled on a hill above the river, watching as the first tourist buses crossed the new bridge. The cub, now noticeably larger and stronger, played among the adults but glanced over at Tariku now and then, as if proud of his human friend. The officials were impressed with the quality of the work, but surprised to see lions so close to the bridge. "Aren't they dangerous?" the chief inspector asked nervously, glancing at the predators. "No," Tariku answered calmly. "That's the local pride. They're the true owners here. We're just guests." By evening, after the visitors and officials had left, Tariku stayed by the river alone. He sat on the same rock where, a month earlier, he had made the fateful decision to save a drowning lion cub. The river flowed calmly beneath the new bridge, reflecting the first stars. The roar of the waterfall now seemed gentle and peaceful. From the twilight, a familiar figure emerged. The lioness who had saved him walked up silently, her eyes glowing in the moonlight like two golden lanterns. She stopped beside the rock and lay down in the grass like a giant house cat. But even in her resting state, she radiated power and wild beauty. They sat together in comfortable silence, man and predator, united by a shared story of survival and mutual rescue. Tariku thought about how one impulsive act could change a life forever. He had saved one small life, and in return, received the protection and friendship of an entire pride. More than that, he had found inner peace, something he had lost a year earlier after Jabari's death. The memory of his brother was no longer a constant source of pain and guilt. Jabari had died. It was a tragic accident, but his death had not been meaningless. It had led to the saving of another life and taught Tariku not to fear taking risks for what is right. He understood now that he could not bring his brother back, but he could go on saving others, both people and animals. The lioness rose from the grass and slowly walked toward the bridge. At the center of the crossing, she stopped and looked back at Tariku. In her eyes was something like an invitation to follow, to see the world through the eyes of wild predators. Tariku stood and followed. They crossed the river together, man and lion, allies in a world where such bonds were thought impossible. On the far side, the rest of the pride was waiting. Mafumu, the male, stepped out from behind a large boulder and gave Tariku a slow, majestic nod, a greeting from equal to equal, a recognition of his place in the savannah's hierarchy. The cub, now a strong adolescent with the first signs of a mane, ran up to him and rubbed against his legs. Tariku petted him, feeling the growing strength beneath the thick golden fur. The young one had grown strong and healthy, full of life and energy. "You've become a real lion," he said softly, and the young predator purred in reply. The sound was full of joy and gratitude. The memory of the rescue hadn't faded. The bond between them remained strong. The pride surrounded Tariku in a loose circle, not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest and loyal ally. He spent half the night with them, sitting by a small fire he had built from dry branches. The lions lay around in various poses, some dozing, some gazing at the stars, others grooming their fur. These were some of the happiest hours of Tariku's life. He had finally found his true place in the world, not as a conqueror of nature, not as its careless master, but as its ally and protector. A story that had begun with the loss of his brother had turned into the salvation of another life, and proved that bonds between different worlds are born from compassion and courage. When the first rays of dawn painted the horizon in shades of pink, Tariku said goodbye to the pride and crossed back to his side of the river. A new workday awaited him, new tasks, new ranger duties. But now he knew for sure that he was not alone in his difficult mission. The lioness who had saved him walked with him to the middle of the bridge. There she stopped and looked into his eyes one last time that night. There was no farewell in her gaze. It was a promise that their paths would cross again and again, that the bond between them would never be broken, that in this vast and often harsh world, each of them had a true friend and guardian. Tariku reached his side of the river and looked back. The pride stood on the other side of the bridge, their silhouettes outlined clearly against the pink morning sky. The cub, now a young and powerful lion, lifted his head and let out a short but strong roar. It was a farewell and a thank you, a recognition and a vow of protection. Then the lions slowly turned and walked back into the savannah. Their everyday tasks awaited them: hunting to feed the family, defending territory from rivals, raising the next generation. But now there was a man on their land whom they considered part of their world. And if he ever needed help, they would come, just as they had come when the great crocodile had threatened his life. Tariku remained alone by the river, but he no longer felt lonely. He had saved one small life in a moment of desperation, following the impulse of his heart rather than reason. In return, he had received something priceless: the friendship and protection of the most powerful predators in Africa. It defied every law of nature and every scientific theory, but it had truly happened. Several months later, a journalist from a national newspaper visited Tariku's sector. He was writing an article about the work of rangers in the remote parts of the park and wanted to conduct an interview. "Tell me about your work," the journalist asked, turning on his recorder. "What's the hardest part of your job?" Tariku paused, looking at the river where the miracle had happened months ago. "The hardest part," he said, "is knowing when to step in and when to let nature take its course. Sometimes one right action at the right moment can change everything. Not just for the animal you help, but for yourself." "Have you ever had a case," the journalist asked, "where such action truly changed something?" Tariku looked across the river, where the familiar pride rested in the shade of the acacias. The cub, now a young lion with thick golden fur, lifted his head and looked their way. For a moment, their eyes met across the water. The gaze of a man and the gaze of a wild predator, bound by an invisible but unbreakable link. "Yes," Tariku answered quietly, "but that's not a story for the papers. Some things are too important to turn into headlines." The journalist tried to press him, but Tariku had already risen and walked toward his jeep. "Some stories are meant to stay between those who live them, between a man and a pride of lions who taught each other that true strength lies not in domination, but in mutual respect and the will to protect." Every time he worked in his sector, the ranger knew that somewhere nearby, in the shadow of a baobab or atop a red hill, yellow eyes were watching him. Not as prey, but as a member of a great family. A family that had been born the day one man chose life over rules, courage over fear. And in the quiet evenings by the river, when the work was done and the stars lit up over the African savanna, Tariku sometimes heard a distant roar, not threatening, but welcoming. It was his lion family letting him know that all was well, that they were near, that the bond between worlds, the human and the wild, still endured, defying all the laws of nature. Thus, in the heart of Africa, by the rushing Sabi River, a story was born. A story of how one moment of bravery can change destinies, both human and lion. A story that proved that the boundaries between species exist only in our minds, and that true bonds are formed not through blood, but through the kinship of spirit.